He rode down the mountain for medicine, but what he found when he got to town wasn't a cure. It was a price tag, hanging from his own son's neck. The snow still clung to the high ridges like a stubborn ghost, but down in the valley, spring was a restless animal. The wind came alive, whispering through the pines, and the sun spilled gold across the thawing mud. This was the season of waking things, of bears stirring in their dens and secrets seeping out of the softening earth. High above it all, on the shoulder of Granite Pass, Noah Thorne watched the world come back to life from a cabin that looked more like a scar than a home. He'd built it with his own 2 hands, log by log, the way his father taught him. Strong, simple, and far enough from the town of Red Creek that trouble would have to crawl on its belly to find him. It had been 2 years. 2 years since he'd led his wife Miriam and their boy Caleb up that winding trail. They were running from the grasping hands and hollow promises of a world that took more than it ever gave. Down in Red Creek, folks started whispering. They called him the Mountain Man, said he'd gone wild, said he talked to trees and had forgotten the sound of a human voice. Noah let them talk. It was better to be a frightening story than a broken man. But this morning, the mountain's silence was broken. Caleb had woken in the dead of night with a cough that shook his small frame, a cough hard enough to bring a speck of blood to his lips. One look at Miriam's face, pale and sharp in the lantern light, told Noah everything. This wasn't some simple chill you could sweat out with pine tea and prayer. The boy needed a doctor, and the only doctor was in Red Creek. A full day's ride through thawing trails, hungry bears, and memories that Noah had tried to bury with every swing of his axe. He left before the sun had even thought about rising. His saddlebag was light, but his heart was a stone. As he pulled on his coat, Miriam pressed a folded scrap of cloth into his hand. He didn't have to look. He knew it was the small swatch from Caleb's pillow, the one she'd stitched with blue thread. It was still warm. He tucked it inside his shirt, a silent promise against his chest. He nodded once. Then he rode. He didn't stop. Not for food, not for rest, not even when his horse nearly lost its footing on the slick, muddy slopes. The miles bled together. The sun climbed and fell. By the time he saw the first rooftops of Red Creek, dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The shadows of the buildings stretched across the main road like long, skeletal fingers. The town hadn't changed, but it felt wrong. The saloon was louder, the boardwalks crowded with strangers in fancy Eastern coats and city shoes. A new banner flapped above the town square, its words stark against the twilight. Spring auction, goods, tools, and indentured servants. Noah's gut went cold. He'd never seen a notice like that before. Indentured servants? Here? He pushed the thought away. Caleb was all that mattered. He spurred his horse toward the clinic, but the clinic was dark. The doors were shuttered, the windows vacant. A crude sign was scrawled in chalk across the glass. Closed indefinitely, by order of the marshal. His pulse hammered in his ears. That didn't make any sense. Old Doc Wexley had been this town's healer for 30 years. A kind, quiet man who never turned anyone away. He'd stitched up Caleb's head himself after a bad fall, his hands steady and gentle. Noah knocked. Once. Twice. The building answered with hollow silence. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He could feel it in the way people hurried past him, their heads down, their eyes avoiding his. He could hear it in the low, ugly hum coming from the town square, and then a voice cut through the air. Loud, booming, triumphant. Next up, a fine set, this one. Healthy, strong bones, and the woman is already trained for domestic work. Obedient, I guarantee it. Noah's blood turned to ice. He didn't walk. He ran. He shoved his way through the crowd gathered in the square. Men in hats and coats, their faces lit by the swinging lanterns of the auction block. It was a stage hastily built, raw timber still bleeding sap. And there, standing on that stage, flanked by 2 men holding rifles, were Miriam and Caleb. The world stopped. Noah couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He could only see. Miriam's hair was a tangled mess, her dress torn at the shoulder. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough rope, her knuckles raw and bleeding. Caleb stood beside her, his small body trembling, clutching her leg. He was still coughing, and around both of their necks, hanging from coarse twine, were thick parchment tags. Price tags. Woman, age 28, good health. Starting bid, $300, boy, age 6. Needs care. Starting bid, $125. Noah felt his knees threaten to buckle. His heart wasn't beating. It was a wild animal trying to claw its way out of his chest. It made no sense. This was impossible. This was a nightmare. Slavery was a ghost, a story from a bygone era. But here, they called it by another name. Indenture. Debt. A legal fiction written in ink and spit. And someone in this town had looked at his wife, at his sick little boy, and put a number on their lives. He was moving before he knew it. A primal roar tore from his throat as he surged through the crowd. A man grabbed his arm. Noah twisted, and there was a sickening crack of bone. Another man stepped in his way. Noah drove his fist into the man's face, a spray of blood and teeth scattering in the dirt. The auctioneer, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, turned in shock. He only had a moment to register the storm that was coming for him. Noah leaped onto the stage like a mountain lion. A guard raised his rifle. Noah was faster. He wrenched the gun away and smashed the butt of it into the man's jaw. The second guard fumbled with his weapon. Noah kicked him squarely in the chest, sending him tumbling off the stage and into the terrified crowd. Screams erupted. Chaos bloomed. "Noah!" Miriam cried, her voice a raw mix of terror and hope. He couldn't hear her, not over the roaring in his own blood. He ripped the ropes from her wrists, scooped Caleb into one arm, and pulled them both behind him. The crowd scattered like frightened birds. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering the wood next to his head. He spun, kicked over a stack of crates, and saw a lantern swinging precariously from a hook. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed it and hurled it with all his might. It shattered against the back of the auction block. Flames erupted. The fire leaped from the dry timber like pure, liquid vengeance. It climbed the stage, devouring the price tags, the ledgers, the whole rotten structure. In the smoke and the panic, Noah grabbed his family and ran. Down an alley, through the choking blackness, Caleb wheezing against his chest. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of town, their lungs burning, their legs shaking. He laid them down gently in the shelter of a cedar grove, his hands trembling with the violence of what he'd just done. Miriam clung to his coat, whispering his name like a prayer, the only word that could anchor her to the world. Noah stared back at the orange glow rising over the rooftops of Red Creek. The fire was a beacon in the night. Who had done this? Who had dared? And why? He didn't have the answers, but as he looked at the smoldering heart of the town, he made a vow. He would find the truth, and he would burn it all down. But first, he had to get them home. Back to the mountain. The one place left in the world where no man could put a number on the ones he loved. But something else was burning now, something deep inside him. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the fire he started tonight was only the beginning. The glow from Red Creek pulsed against the night sky like a weak and dying heart. The auction block was nothing but ash and memory now, but the real damage wasn't to the wood. It was to the man standing at the edge of the cedar grove, still as a statue, watching the last embers of his old life fade away. Noah Thorne hadn't spoken a word since they'd fled. He hadn't asked Miriam how this happened. He hadn't tried to explain the fury that had turned him into an animal on that stage. He didn't have to. She could see it in his eyes. It was a look she hadn't seen since before they'd sought refuge in the mountains. It was the look of a man pushed past his limits, a look that promised reckoning, not reason, vengeance, not justice. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white stones in the gloom. Miriam sat with Caleb huddled in her lap. The boy was shivering, a deep, rattling cold that had nothing to do with the night air. He coughed again, a wet, ragged sound that made Noah flinch. He turned from the dying fire of the town, his face a mask carved from granite. "We move now," he said, his voice the grating sound of rocks grinding together. "They'll regroup. They'll come looking." Miriam didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes swollen from smoke and terror. She tried to lift Caleb, but her legs trembled and gave way. In an instant, Noah was there, sweeping the boy into his arms. For a man filled with such a storm, he held his son with a gentleness that was heartbreaking. They turned their backs on the town and plunged into the darkness of the forest, climbing toward the high ridges where the world grew wild and the law of men faded into whispers. The climb was a slow, agonizing torture. Caleb was a dead weight in Noah's arms, his feverish breaths hot against Noah's neck. Miriam stumbled, her strength failing, but she never complained. Silence was their only language now, a shared space filled with unspoken fear and a burning need for answers. By midnight, the moon finally broke through the clouds, washing the forest in a pale, ghostly light. Noah led them off the main trail, down a steep, narrow gulch he knew was treacherous. Hunters avoided this place, that's why he chose it. Miriam slipped, her foot catching on a slick root. Noah caught her just in time. She leaned against a tree, her body shaking with exhaustion. "We have to rest, Noah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Caleb, he needs warmth." Noah looked down at his son. The boy's lips had a bluish tint. His forehead was slick with a cold sweat. He nodded once, his jaw tight. He pointed to a rocky overhang a few yards ahead, a shallow cave half hidden by brush. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the wind. He laid Caleb down, then moved with a desperate speed, gathering dry twigs and moss. Within minutes, a small, courageous fire flickered to life, its light a fragile dance of hope against the cold stone. Miriam cradled Caleb, murmuring soft words, trying to coax a few sips of water past his lips. Noah sat apart, staring into the flames, his mind a maelstrom. He hadn't recognized most of the men at the auction, but one face was seared into his memory. Deputy Marshal Granger, a man who'd always craved more power, more control. Granger hadn't just been watching the auction, he'd been overseeing it, a clipboard in his hand, and a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. But Granger wasn't smart enough to orchestrate this alone. This kind of rot had deep roots. It needed fertilizer, councilmen, business owners, men who would sell their own souls to keep their boots clean and their pockets full. They had crossed a line. They had put a price on his family. And for that, there was no forgiveness. "They came 2 nights ago," Miriam finally said, her voice a ghost in the flickering light. Noah didn't look at her, but his entire body went rigid. He listened. "They said you owed taxes," she continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Said our cabin was on county land and you hadn't registered it. They showed me a paper. It had a seal. It looked official, but it felt wrong. Granger was there. He just watched as his men tore our home apart. They said if I didn't comply, they would take Caleb first." Noah's hands curled into fists, the muscles in his arms trembling with a rage so profound it was silent. "They locked us in the livery stable," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths through the soot on her cheeks. "The next morning they put those tags on us. They said we could buy our freedom if someone paid the debt." "What debt?" Noah growled, the word ripped from his throat. "I don't know. Something about mountain permits and back fees. It was all lies, Noah. It was just an excuse." "Of course it was. It was a weapon disguised as a law, a way for the greedy to swallow up the land of anyone who couldn't fight back in a courtroom. He'd seen it coming for years, but he never imagined it would come for him. For them." He stood up, pulled his knife, and began carving a mark into the bark of a nearby pine. A single sharp line, a promise, a warning. "You're not going back down there, are you?" Miriam asked, her voice trembling. I'm not leaving you, he answered, his focus locked on the blade. But I'm going back. They won't stop with us. Not now. She was silent for a long time, stroking Caleb's feverish hair. Then she asked the question that had been sitting like a stone in her heart. What if they come for him again, Noah? What if they take him when you're gone? He turned, and his eyes burned with the reflected light of the fire, two hot coals in the darkness. They won't, he said, the words a raw promise. But as he stared out into the oppressive blackness of the woods, a new, terrifying thought took root. What if this wasn't just about their land? What if they were chosen for a reason? And what if escaping wasn't enough? The sound came just before dawn, the faint, rhythmic beat of hooves on the southern trail. Noah was already on his feet, rifle loaded, every muscle coiled tight. He motioned for Miriam to stay low, to keep the fire from casting shadows. The sound grew louder. 2 riders, not a posse, just scouts, looking for tracks, looking for them. He didn't hesitate. He moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn gloom, circling around the thicket, taking a position behind a fallen log that overlooked a sharp bend in the trail. He waited. The first rider came into view. He was young, barely 20, with a nervous slouch. The second was older, with a thick mustache and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Both wore the badge of a Red Creek deputy. Noah let the young one pass. Then he stepped out from behind the log. There was one shot, sharp and final. The young rider tumbled from his saddle before he even knew what was happening. The second man spun around, his eyes wide with shock, his hand flying toward his pistol. "Drop it!" Noah's voice was as cold and hard as the stone beneath his feet. The man froze. He saw the look in Noah's eyes, the utter lack of hesitation, and his hand slowly fell away from his gun. His revolver thudded softly into the mud. "Where's Granger?" Noah asked, his voice low and dangerous. "In town," the man stammered, his confidence evaporating. "The council's calling a meeting about the fire." "They're spooked," Noah stated. It wasn't a question. Spooked? They're terrified. Half the buyers fled town. They're saying the mountain man brought the devil with him. The man was trembling now. They weren't expecting this. "Good," Noah said. Then he swung the butt of his rifle, and the world went dark for the deputy. He stripped the badges from both men, took their guns and ammunition, and melted back into the woods. When he returned to the overhang, Miriam was staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Awe. "What now?" she whispered. Noah didn't answer. He just held up one of the tin badges, its surface catching the first rays of morning light. He stared at it, a plan beginning to form in the cold, calculating part of his mind. A plan born of fire and rage. They had used papers and badges to try and destroy his family. They had used the law as a weapon. Now, he would turn their own system against them. He would use their symbols, their rules, their fear. He would become the ghost they whispered about. He would become the devil they feared. And he would dismantle their world, one lie at a time. But as he looked at the badge in his hand, a chilling question surfaced. Who gave Granger the authority to issue these? Who was the real power in Red Creek? This wasn't just a town's corruption. This was something more, something bigger, and it was just getting started. The cabin greeted them with a cold, hollow silence. The door hung crooked on its hinges where Granger's men had kicked it in. Melted snow dripped from the eaves, each drop a slow, mournful beat on the warped floorboards. It smelled of mildew and violation. Their simple furniture was overturned, shelves swept clean, their life scattered and broken. But it was still home. It was still shelter. Noah barred the door, the heavy wooden beams sliding into place with a sound of grim finality. He had carried Caleb the last 2 miles without stopping, the boy's dead weight a constant, burning reminder of what was at stake. Exhaustion gnawed at him, but there was no time for rest. First, a fire. His hands moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 cold mornings. Then, water from the cistern, set to boil over the flames. Only when Caleb was tucked beneath every quilt they owned, and Miriam was warming her frozen hands by the hearth, did Noah allow himself to sit. He didn't relax. He couldn't. He sat at the rough-hewn table, pulling his knife and a whetstone from his pack. The scrape of steel on stone was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, angry whisper that filled the space where words failed. Miriam watched him, her heart aching. The storm in his eyes hadn't subsided. It had settled. It was deeper now, colder. A purpose was taking shape in him, forged in the fire of the auction block. "Granger thinks I'll hide," Noah said suddenly, his voice a low rumble. "He thinks I'll run back to the trees and wait for the seasons to change." He wasn't asking for her opinion. He was laying the foundation for what came next. "He's wrong." He stood and walked to the back wall, where he kept his oldest gear. A heavy oilskin coat he hadn't worn in years, a coil of climbing rope, and a rusted holster that held a pistol he thought he'd never need again. He began to prepare, his movements deliberate, methodical, oiling the rifle, counting his bullets, checking the pistol he'd taken from the deputy. Every action was precise, imbued with a terrible gravity. Caleb coughed in his sleep, a weak, rattling sound from beneath the mountain of quilts. Miriam rushed to his side, her hand on his forehead. Noah paused, his gaze fixed on his son's small, trembling form. The sight seemed to harden his resolve, turning it from iron to steel. He would not live in a world where a price could be hung on his child. He would not let this stand. If he had to pull Red Creek apart, nail by nail, board by board, then so be it. He left before the next sunrise. Miriam didn't try to stop him. She simply pressed a flask of warm broth and a strip of dried venison into his hand. "Come back," she whispered, her voice fierce. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. He walked, not rode. On foot, he was a whisper, a shadow. He stuck to the high ridgelines, moving through the trees like he was born of them. It took him the better part of the day to reach the hills overlooking Red Creek. The town was a nervous animal. New fences had gone up. Guards looking jumpy and ill at ease stood post outside the council hall. The town had grown fat on its corruption, and fat things were always careless. Noah waited for night to fall, a patient predator. He slipped between the buildings, a ghost in the alleys. He made his way to the livery, the same place they had locked up his family. Inside, he found them. Half a dozen crates stacked against the wall. Each was branded with a small, neat symbol, RCI Red Creek indentures. He pried one open. Inside were chains, ledgers, and stacks of blank parchment tags, the tools of their vile trade, proof. He didn't burn them. Not yet. He took one of the crates and carried it deep into the hills. By morning the town was buzzing. A fire in the woods. Nothing major, but a crate had gone missing from the livery. Not just any crate. The one containing the council's master registry of all indenture contracts. Names, debts, locations. It was all ash now. Granger was apoplectic. He stormed through town, red-faced and shouting, offering rewards for information. The new sheriff, a young man who looked like he was in way over his head, just nodded and scribbled uselessly in a notebook. Noah watched it all from the shadows of a rooftop. This was just the beginning. That night, he hit the marshal's office. Not with fire, but with silence and stealth. He didn't take money. He took every last bullet they had, every single round of ammunition. He left behind a single stark message, scrawled in charcoal on the marshal's desk. Your laws won't save you. The next morning, the town was on the verge of panic. Businesses were shuttered. The councilmen were arguing openly in the street. Granger paced outside the saloon like a caged wolf, his hand twitching over his empty holster. And that's when Noah made his move. He walked into town in broad daylight, unarmed. The effect was instantaneous. The street went silent. The crowd parted before him like the sea before Moses. He walked with a steady, unhurried gait, his eyes fixed forward. He didn't flinch. He didn't run. He walked straight to the chapel. He knew Councilman Barrett, the richest and most powerful man in town. took his evening meal there. Barrett was sitting with two other men when Noah pushed open the doors. The room fell silent. A fork clattered against a plate. "Noah Thorne," Barrett said, his voice cautious but steady. "I didn't think we'd see you in the light of day." "You shouldn't have," Noah replied, his voice calm. "I suppose you're here for answers," Barrett said, leaning back in his chair, trying to project an authority he no longer felt. "No," Noah said, stepping forward into the light. "I'm here for terms." The men stared at him, stunned. "Terms?" Barrett repeated, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You will dissolve the indenture program," Noah said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You will burn every contract. You will release every person on your list, and you will return their land, their names, and their lives." Barrett let out a short, sharp laugh, a scoff. "And if we refuse?" Before Noah could answer, the chapel doors burst open. Granger stood there, rifle raised, his face a mask of fury. "Enough of this! Thorne, you're a criminal, an animal!" Noah didn't even turn to look at him. His eyes remained locked on Barrett. "You've been in the woods too long, Thorne," Granger spat, stepping forward. "There's law here now. There's civilization." Finally, Noah turned his head slowly, meeting Granger's gaze. A cold, dead smile touched his lips. "Civilization," Noah said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "doesn't hang price tags on children." Granger's face twitched. "You're under arrest. You'll need more than that badge to stop what's coming," Noah said. And with that, he turned and walked out of the chapel, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a scream. He expected a shot in the back, but none came. Granger didn't fire. Barrett didn't give the order. They just watched him go. Because they knew. They knew something had broken. The fear they had used as a weapon was now turning against them. The people were watching. And a man who could walk into the heart of their power, unarmed and unafraid, was not a man at all. He was a reckoning, and he had just begun to collect his debt. The quiet on the mountain didn't last long. 2 days after Noah's chilling walk through town, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed up the slopes. Miriam heard them first. She stood on the porch, Caleb held tight against her, and watched 6 riders crest the lower ridge. She turned. Noah was already there, at the edge of the trees, rifle in hand. He hadn't been surprised. He'd been waiting. These men weren't charging. They were moving slowly, deliberately. This wasn't an attack. It was a show of force. A message sent on horseback meant to intimidate, to scare him back into the shadows. They thought he was just a cornered animal. They'd forgotten who built this mountain. "Inside," Noah said to Miriam, his voice low. "Bolt the door." She didn't hesitate. The solid thud of the crossbar sliding into place was the only sound. Noah didn't retreat to the cabin. He slipped around the back, down into a shallow ravine he'd cleared years ago. When he'd first built this place, he'd carved sight lines and escape routes into the land around it. He'd been thinking about bears back then. Now he was thinking about monsters who wore badges. He reached a large boulder overlooking the clearing just as the riders pulled up. Granger was at the front, dismounting with a theatrical flourish, his polished boots sinking into the soft earth. He looked ridiculous, a town dog trying to play the wolf. "Noah Thorne!" Granger called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet air. "You've made a real mess down there. We're here to talk. The council wants to find a peaceful resolution." Noah remained silent, a ghost among the rocks. He raised his rifle, resting it on the flat stone, the cold metal a familiar comfort against his cheek. "See, the thing is, Thorne," Granger continued, pulling a folded paper from his coat, "this town is growing, and growth requires order. It requires rules." Noah's voice cut through the air, calm and clear as a winter morning. "You mean it requires profit?" Granger flinched. The men behind him shifted uneasily. "You don't want order," Noah's voice carried down from the ridge, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You want fear. You want people too broken to fight back, when you take everything they have. One of the deputies, bolder than the rest, stepped forward. Are you pointing a rifle at an officer of the law? No, Noah said. I'm pointing a rifle at the man who put a price on my son. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the clearing. Granger's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: fear, rage, humiliation. You can't stop this, Thorn, he finally shouted, his voice cracking. You're just one man. You have nothing. A shack, a sick boy, and a wife. Good, Noah said. That makes me harder to find. The shot was a single, deafening crack that ripped through the quiet. It wasn't aimed at a man. It hit the silver saddle horn on Granger's horse, shattering it into pieces. The horse screamed, reared violently, and threw Granger into the mud. His men scrambled for their guns, but Noah was already gone. He'd melted back into the trees, leaving only the echo of his defiance hanging in the air. They didn't come back. Not that day. Instead, the town sent a different kind of message. The next morning, Noah found a small bundle at the base of the trail leading to his cabin. It was wrapped in plain cloth. Inside was a child's shoe, small, worn, and caked with mud. And a note, 4 words scrawled in hurried, angry letters. Stop or others pay. He brought it inside. Miriam's face went white as a sheet when she saw it. Whose is it? She whispered. It doesn't matter, Noah said. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. They're bluffing. This is what desperate men do. But as he stared at the tiny shoe, he knew this was an escalation. They would take someone else. A homesteader. A poor shopkeeper. They would manufacture a debt, forge a warrant, and drag another family onto that block. And they would call it justice. They would make the town watch, a clear and brutal warning aimed directly at him. We have to go back, Miriam said suddenly. Noah looked at her, startled. Back? To town? With Caleb still sick and a price on our heads? You started this, Noah, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, steely resolve he hadn't heard before. They will punish someone else for what you did. If we hide up here, another family suffers. I won't have that on my conscience. We finish this. Together. He saw the truth in her eyes, and the pride. Hiding on this mountain wasn't freedom. It was just a prettier cage. He nodded slowly. All right. Together. They left that night, under the cover of a thick, rolling fog. They didn't sneak into Red Creek this time. At dawn, they walked down the main road, right through the center of town. Noah carried Caleb, who was bundled in blankets, his breathing a little easier now thanks to the medicine Noah had finally managed to buy from a traveling peddler. Miriam walked beside him, her head held high. The town stopped. A woman gasped and dropped her basket. Men froze on the boardwalks. No one called the marshal. No one raised a hand. They just stared. The fear in the town had cracked, and something new was seeping through. Respect. Hope. The deputies outside the council hall looked lost, caught between their orders and the unnerving sight of the family they had tried to break, now walking toward them like avenging angels. Noah walked past them without a word and pushed open the doors to the council chamber. Granger and Barrett were inside, huddled over a table of documents. They looked up, their faces a mask of disbelief and fury. You can't just... Granger started, jumping to his feet. You have 2 choices, Noah said, his voice echoing in the stone room. End this now, or I will end it for you. Barrett scoffed, trying to regain his composure. And how do you plan to do that, Thorn? With threats and righteous anger? Noah reached into his coat and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. He threw them onto the table. They were the original half-burned ledgers from the auction, the real ones. I don't need threats, Noah said. I have proof, forgery, fraudulent warrants, the names of the buyers you brought in from out of state. I have everything. But then, a new twist. The one he hadn't seen coming. Barrett wasn't just a villain. He was a victim. You think I wanted this? Barrett suddenly hissed, his face pale and slick with sweat. He pointed a trembling finger at the papers. You think this was my idea? He fumbled inside his own desk, pulling out another document, this one crisp and official-looking. He slammed it down on the table. It was an indenture contract for his own family, his wife, and 2 daughters. "We all have debts, Thorne," Barrett whispered, his voice cracking. This whole system, it's run by someone else, a company. They own the bank, they own the deeds, they own us. I did what I had to do to protect my family." Noah stared at the paper, the world shifting beneath his feet. This was bigger than Red Creek, bigger than Granger's greed or Barrett's cowardice. This was a machine. Suddenly, the doors to the hall flew open again. It was the town doctor, old Wexley. His face was ashen with terror. "Thorne, you have to know! The signatures, I was forced—" He never finished the sentence. A single, loud gunshot exploded in the chamber. Dr. Wexley crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Granger stood in the doorway, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. "He was a traitor!" Granger snarled. "And so are you!" But his eyes weren't on Noah. They were on Barrett. Before anyone could react, Granger raised his pistol again and fired. Barrett collapsed over the table, his own blood soaking the contracts that had sealed his fate. Granger turned to run, but the doorway was blocked by the townspeople. They had gathered, drawn by the shouting, and now they stood in silent judgment. The young sheriff was at the front, his hand on his own gun, his face a mixture of fear and newfound resolve. Granger was trapped. He looked at Noah, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat. "They'll send more. They'll burn this whole valley to the ground to get what they want. Harrow's End. Harrow's End never forgets." Then he turned, shoved his way through the stunned crowd, and disappeared. The system in Red Creek was broken. Its leaders were dead or gone. But Noah knew with a chilling certainty that he hadn't won. He had just kicked the hornet's nest, and a new name echoed in his mind, a name that felt like a death sentence. Harrow's End. The peace they had fought for in Red Creek was a fragile, fleeting thing, a ghost of a victory. The town was free, but Noah knew they were not. Granger's final, desperate words, Harrow's End, had planted a seed of ice in his gut. It was a name spoken like a curse. They returned to the mountain, but the cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow looked like a man with a rifle. A week later he came. He wasn't a deputy or a thug. He rode a strong, dark horse and wore a clean black coat. He didn't carry a rifle. He didn't need one. His power was in his stillness, in the cold, detached confidence of a man who dealt in outcomes, not emotions. He stopped 20 paces from the cabin. "Noah Thorne," he said. It wasn't a question. Noah stepped off the porch, his own rifle held low but ready. "I'm here on behalf of certain parties," the man said, his voice as dry as dust. "Interests who believe you are in possession of documents that do not belong to you." "You mean proof of your crimes," Noah said. The man almost smiled. "Property, stolen from a legal and binding enterprise. The situation with your family, while regrettable, was processed according to county law. The system you disrupted isn't illegal, Mr. Thorne. It's just efficient." The cold arrogance of it stole Noah's breath. "You sent Granger. You killed Wexley." "Loose ends," the man said, waving a dismissive hand. "Unfortunate but necessary. We are prepared to be generous. Return what was taken, and we will consider your debt paid." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he added, his voice dropping, "We're even aware of your son's persistent lung condition. Our associates in Harrow's End have access to medicines you can only dream of. A full recovery, a clean slate. All you have to do is be reasonable." They knew about Caleb's cough. The level of surveillance was terrifying. This wasn't just a company. It was an octopus with tentacles everywhere. "There's no deal," Noah said, his voice gravel. The man nodded, as if expecting this answer. "A pity." He reached into his coat and tossed a small object into the dirt. A brass pin, polished and gleaming, the kind the guards at Harrow's End wore. When you change your mind. He turned his horse and rode away, swallowed by the trees as silently as he had arrived. The next day, Noah found it nailed to a tree just 50 feet from the cabin. A freshly printed contract. Indenture pending. Names: Miriam Thorne, Caleb Thorne. Status: reclamation authorized. Beneath the fresh ink was a faded, older stamp, a symbol from a different company, one Noah recognized from the dark days of the war. This machine hadn't just appeared. It had been here for years, feeding on the desperate, changing its name like a snake sheds its skin. "They're trying to scare us," Miriam said, her hand trembling as she touched the paper. "They're not trying," Noah said, his voice grim. "They're succeeding." That night he found them, 2 men moving through the woods near the cabin. Not scouts, hired guns. He didn't wait for them to make a move. He used the terrain, his knowledge of the mountain, and the cold fury that now lived permanently in his heart. He led them into a deadfall trap he'd built years ago for hunting elk. He didn't kill them. He disabled them, took their weapons, and searched their belongings. In one man's coat he found a letter. "Mr. Thorne is not to be approached directly. Locate and retrieve the subjects. Do not engage. Payment upon completion. Atten, Field Director Travers, a name to hunt." He returned to the cabin at dawn, his face grim. He showed Miriam the letter. She read the name, and a flicker of something, recognition, fear, crossed her face. "I have to go to Harrow's End," Noah said. "I have to cut the head off this snake." "You can't go alone," she said. She reached into the small wooden chest where she kept her few precious belongings. She pulled out a faded, folded piece of paper. This might help. Noah unfolded it. It was a rough map of a town he'd never seen, with a small shed near a rail yard circled. Next to it were 2 initials, WG. "Who is this?" Noah asked. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. "My cousin, William Grant. I thought he died in the rail camps years ago. A month ago, a traveling merchant brought me this. He said a man with haunted eyes gave it to him and told him to find the woman from Red Creek whose husband burned the auction block. Noah, he was taken by the company. He's been a ghost in their machine all this time." The fight was no longer just his. It was in his wife's blood, too. He packed his saddlebag, the rifle he'd taken from the deputy, and the name of a man he had to find. He kissed Caleb's sleeping forehead and held Miriam for a long moment. "I'll be fast," he promised. He rode east, toward the rising sun, toward the place where freedom went to die. He didn't know if he was riding toward a solution or a suicide mission. All he knew was that Harrow's End had his family's name in a book, and he was going to burn that book to ash. The journey to Harrow's End was like crossing into another world. The land grew flat and unforgiving, the sky vast and empty. This was company country. The rivers, the trees, even the dirt seemed to bear an invisible brand. Harrow's End rose from the plains like a fortress. There was no wood, only stone and steel. No church steeple, only the smokestacks of the depot. No laughter, only the rhythmic hiss of steam and the silent shuffling feet of its people. They were ghosts, their eyes hollowed out by debt and despair. At the center of it all stood the vault, a 3-story brick monolith with no windows, only a single massive steel door. Above it, the company seal, a compass wrapped in chains. Noah found the shed near the rail yard that Miriam's cousin had marked. Inside, a thin man with grease-stained hands and haunted eyes looked up from a crate of lanterns. "She sent you," William Grant said, his voice rough. It wasn't a question. "She did," Noah answered. "You lit a fire in Red Creek," Grant said, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes. "But this place, this is the furnace. They don't just keep contracts here, Thorne. They keep a ledger, the real one, the master book. It's got every name, every debt, every soul they've ever owned, going back 50 years. Burn that book and their entire empire on this frontier turns to dust." "How do I get to it?" "You don't," Grant said flatly. "It's in the basement vault. 2 keys are required. One held by the station warden, the other by a handler who visits from corporate once a month. He's due tomorrow. It was an impossible plan, but it was the only one they had. Grant pulled a gray uniform from beneath the floorboards. The handler who was supposed to come, he had an unfortunate accident last night. Now you're him. The next morning, Noah Thorne walked into the lion's den, dressed in the gray coat of his enemy, a stolen badge pinned to his chest. He walked through the gates of Harrow's End. No one looked twice. He was just another cog in the machine. He signed for the handler's key. He walked to the vault. The station warden, a bald, severe man with eyes like chips of ice, was waiting for him. "You're late," the warden grumbled. Noah just nodded and inserted his key. The warden used his. The heavy door to the basement stairwell creaked open. "You have 1 hour," the warden said, sealing the door behind him. The basement was cold and dry, smelling of old paper and dust. And there it was, on a heavy oak stand in the center of the room. The ledger, bound in red leather, its pages filled with the elegant, cruel script of 100 years of human misery. He opened it. He saw the names of families, towns, entire generations listed as assets. Then he saw it. Thorne, Caleb. The entry was dated 2 years ago, a debt inherited from a grandfather he never knew, a debt the company had simply waited to collect. Then his blood ran cold. He flipped back, further and further, his hands shaking. And he found another entry. Thorne, Noah. It was from his time in the army, years before he'd even met Miriam. Next to his name were 2 words: asset, potential recruitment. They hadn't just found him, they had targeted him. His entire life, a file in a book. They had watched him, waited for him to be vulnerable, and then they had sprung their trap. A white-hot rage, purer and more potent than anything he had ever felt, consumed him. He took out the oil Grant had given him. He soaked the book, the stand, the floor. He lit a flare. The fire didn't roar, it hissed, a hungry, vengeful sound. He heard footsteps above. The warden was coming back too soon. He lit 2 more flares and threw them into the towering shelves of paper contracts that lined the walls. Smoke billowed. Alarms shrieked. Noah sprinted for the stairs. The warden stood at the top, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You!" There was no time for words. Noah charged, slamming his shoulder into the man, sending them both tumbling back into the main chamber. The room was already an inferno. The warden lunged, his hands clawing for Noah's throat. They fought. 2 desperate men in a burning tomb, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000,000 broken promises. Noah landed a blow, and the warden staggered back, disappearing into the wall of flame. Noah scrambled out the front doors just as the south wing of the vault collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks and thunder. The town square was chaos. People screamed and ran, pointing at the pillar of black smoke that was once the symbol of their unbreakable chains. Noah stripped off the coat, discarded the badge, and slipped through the alleys, a ghost once more. Grant was waiting by the water tower with a horse and a pack. "You did it," Grant whispered, his haunted eyes filled with a terrifying light. "You actually did it." "They'll come for me," Noah said. "They're already coming for everyone," Grant replied, handing him a folded paper. It was a list of names, of other ghosts like him, scattered across the territories. "Find them, warn them, the fire is spreading." Noah rode west, the flames of Harrow's End at his back. He didn't know if he had saved his family or doomed them all, but as he saw the distant silhouette of the mountains rising to meet him, he knew one thing for sure. The company had made a fatal mistake. They had tried to turn a man into a number. Instead, they had turned him into a fire. And now, he was going to burn their whole world down. He returned to Miriam a changed man. The soot on his coat would wash away, but the fire he'd seen in that vault, the fire of his own name written in a ledger of doom, had burned itself into his soul. The brief, fragile peace was shattered. Harrow's End would not forgive. It would not forget. They sent their answer 3 days later. Not with messengers, but with assassins. Men who moved like wolves in the night, armed with new rifles and silent, deadly intent. They didn't knock. They set up in the trees, waiting to turn his home into his tomb. But Noah was no longer just a father protecting his family. He was a soldier in a war he didn't start, but was determined to finish. He met their silent violence with his own. The fight was brutal, close, and ugly. 2 of the assassins now lay buried in unmarked graves behind the cabin. A third escaped into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood. But before the man vanished, he left a sign. A specific, intricate knot tied in a piece of rope left on a branch. A military knot. The kind Noah hadn't seen since the war. They weren't just hiring thugs. They were recruiting men like him. Former soldiers. Men who knew how to hunt, how to kill, and how to survive. The company's reach was longer and more insidious than he could have ever imagined. They had to move. Again. This time, not to a cabin, but to a place of stone and shadow, an abandoned quarry, a wound in the earth that offered sightlines for miles. Here, they would make their stand. And here, he came for them. The man who rode into the quarry was not like the others. He led a posse of 6, all hard-faced men with the cold, dead eyes of professionals. The leader dismounted, and Noah recognized him from the files he'd stolen. Travers, the field director, the company's chief wolf. "Noah Thorne," Travers called out, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You've been a busy man. Arson, destruction of corporate property, murder of licensed contractors. They came to my home to kill my family." Noah's voice was flat, hard steel. "You were trespassing on an asset," Travers countered, tilting his head. "The land doesn't matter, Thorne. The contracts do. You've stirred up a hornet's nest. But the board wants to make you an offer. They admire your tenacity. Come with us. Help us restore order. There's a place for a man like you in our organization." It was the ultimate temptation, the devil offering him a seat at the table. Miriam stepped out of the cave behind Noah, Caleb holding her hand, his small face a mask of fear and defiance. Noah looked from his son to the man who represented everything he hated. "Tell your board," Noah said, his voice ringing with the authority of a king, "that the fire is just getting started." Travers smiled, a cold, empty thing. "So be it. I knew your old commanding officer, Thorne. He always said you were too sentimental to make the hard choices, that you let emotion cloud your judgment." The words hit Noah harder than any bullet. It was an ideological war now, a battle for the soul of the frontier. "We aren't here to kill you today," Travers said, swinging back onto his horse. "That would be a waste. We'll be back. Not with 6 men, but with 60. As they rode away, Noah knew what he had to do. He couldn't win by hiding. He had to fight. He had to build an army of his own. Using the list Grant had given him, he began to seek them out. The other ghosts. The forgotten souls chewed up and spit out by the company machine. He found Ruth, a blacksmith's daughter who now forged weapons in a hidden cave. He found Daniel, a preacher who had lost his faith but not his fire, leading a congregation of the dispossessed. He found Roscoe, a former railguard haunted by the faces of the children he couldn't save. One by one they came. The angry, the broken, the defiant. They came to the quarry, drawn by the legend of the man who burned the vault. Noah taught them to fight, to track, to disappear. Miriam organized them, creating a network of spies and supply lines. Caleb, no longer just a boy, watched and learned, his eyes holding the wisdom of a world far older than his years. The company returned, just as Travers had promised, not with 60 men, but with a train, an armored train, filled with enforcers, steel-plated wagons, and enough firepower to pacify a small country. They set up an outpost by the river, a fortress of steel and arrogance. They were hunting one man. But they weren't hunting a man anymore. They were hunting an idea. Noah began a campaign of psychological warfare. A supply cart vanished in the night. A guard disappeared from his post, his rifle found hanging from a tree like a morbid ornament. The enforcers grew jumpy, firing at shadows, their iron-clad confidence beginning to rust. Then on the 7th night, Noah walked into their camp, alone. He stepped out of the trees, a ghost in the firelight. Rifles snapped up. Men shouted. "You're trespassing," Noah said, his voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. The commander, a young, arrogant officer, stepped forward. "You're Thorn, the arsonist. You're a dead man." "You can leave now," Noah said, ignoring the threat. "Take your train and go back east, or you can stay here and learn what happens when you try to own a man's soul." He turned his back on them and walked away into the darkness. They didn't shoot. The sheer, unbelievable audacity of it had frozen them. But the next morning, the commander received a telegraph from Travers. It contained a single chilling order. "Pull back. He's not the target. He's the bait." The company had laid a trap. They wanted all the dissenters, all the ghosts, gathered in one place. They wanted to crush the rebellion before it could truly begin. But they had underestimated their enemy. Noah knew it was a trap. The message he'd received from a stranger weeks ago. "Tell him we're ready," was the signal. While the company's army focused on him, his own army was moving. All across the territory, the uprising began. Ruth, the blacksmith, led a team that destroyed a key railway trestle, cutting off the company's reinforcements. Daniel, the preacher, guided hundreds of families through secret mountain passes to safety. Roscoe, the ex-guard, set fires at company depots and supply dumps, from Harrow's End to the Western Sea. The company had tried to corner a wolf. Instead, they had unleashed a wildfire. The war was far from over. But as Noah stood on the ridge of the quarry with Miriam and Caleb by his side, they saw it. On the distant hills, then on the mountains beyond, signal fires began to burn. One by one, they answered his call, a chain of defiance stretching across the dark frontier. They were not alone. The world had tried to break him, to erase him, to put a price on his son. But it had failed. Because some men aren't meant to be owned, some men are meant to be free. And in the heart of that man, a fire still burned, ready to consume anyone who dared to stand in its way. If you believe that the courage of one family can change the world, and that some debts should never be paid, then hit that subscribe button. Because the story of the ghosts of the frontier and the war against Harrow's End was only just beginning.